Thanks for coming, everybody. All right. Let's not make it weird, all friends and colleagues. Yeah, my joke about my last name, last time I was on this stage at Frontend Conference was much funnier, Leon. Okay, so welcome everybody to the second talk about design systems today. I'm actually pretty happy that we're getting 3 different talks with 3 different perspectives, as it turns out, on the matter. And before I start, I'm going to go and just reintroduce myself, because there's never enough of my last name. I work at Homegate as a Principal Frontend Engineer, and Homegate is a Swiss digital real estate marketplace that some of you probably know if you're casually browsing real estate on a lazy Sunday mornings with a cup of coffee. So the company exists for a while now, since 2001, and I joined Homegate at a really exciting time, about 3 years ago. It was a moment when companies usually realize that they have accumulated quite a bit of code over the years, and that there is newer, better technology available, and then the competition is getting younger, faster, and overall stronger. So at Homegate, we were at the point when our big monolithic application took several hours to release, and naturally we did not do it very often, and every time we did it, it felt like super risky. And on our UX kitchen, we also could use a few improvements. We had several competing style guides, and I think at some point we have calculated around 20 different shades of our primary brand color simultaneously in use. So you get the idea, right? It was clear that we had to modernize, and our main product goals were, of course, to ship faster all our new exciting features, and to be able to deliver the brand-aligned user experience that is consistent. So on the technical side, we decided to lean into microservices so that different parts of our business could be evolving independently and also deployed independently, to do continuous deployment, to be able to ship multiple times a day, and to also split up our big engineering organization into multiple small cross-functional product squads that would be responsible for their part of the business end-to-end. Naturally, with this kind of setup, you would start thinking about, but how would you guarantee brand consistency with all this distributed organization? So, of course, there were people who have heard about design systems before in the company. Some of them are here, actually. We have our designer back there taking pictures. Make sure you talk to her afterwards. What we thought we had to do to actually start and integrate a design system into the company is that designers would just go ahead to detect common patterns, they would put them into Sketch library, engineers are going to develop some UI components we could all share, and then all together we're going to spin up one of those beautiful documentation websites everybody likes to put on their portfolios. What we actually had to do, what we didn't realize, is that there is a lot of work that needs to be done to actually integrate the built design system into your organization. And that you have to do things that, as an engineer, you do not always do in your daily work. So you have to drive adoption of your ideas and of your library. You have to organize communications around all of that. And you even have to sell the design systems sometimes to all the skeptics. What I'm going to be talking today is something we also realized in the process of building these things over the years, is that certain technical decisions that we do on a daily basis as engineers could actually make this other part, the people part of design system, much easier. And I'm going to be showing what we've learned in that regard using our design system as a case study. So I'm going to talk about where it all began, how we structured our first release, how we developed different patterns, and all the struggles that we had regarding scaling, adoption, and engagement. So let's go. We all keep being told by many, many design system experts that design systems are not able to exist in a vacuum. They are intended to power real products, and they have to learn from these products to actually improve and evolve. And so same design system experts recommend starting a design system while developing a small product so that you could immediately test your patterns in the context and so that you are able to figure out all the nitty-gritty details and processes while your scale is still small. So kind of a pilot project. As you can imagine, at the point when the entire code was supposed to be re-engineered in the company, there was no shortage of the projects to pick from. So we decided to take our most important page, the core of our business, the page that displays a single real estate listing, and to use that as our pilot project, which worked quite well for us in the long run because it was relatively simple. It had tons of potentially common patterns like form fields, modals, tabs, galleries. And because it was the first user-facing product that we were about to put on the new rails, so to say, the entire company was kind of looking forward at it. They were expecting to see some interesting progress, some nice design decisions, so it served as a really good marketing platform for our design system idea as well. For our first release, so while designers were busy figuring out the common patterns and all the inconsistencies, engineers went and started figuring out the technical part, right? So we wanted to have a design system that is powered by a UI component library that people could share across all our product squads. So we started super dumb and simple. I don't think there could be anything like more dumb than that. We created a folder straight in the same repository as our pilot project was, put there, I think, one single CSS file with some variables, one icon, and one Vue.js component, which was perfectly enough to start figuring out the technical setup. We spin up a preview environment with a thing called Vue StyleGuideist. We're using Vue at Homegate. That, as all other solutions of that class, allowed us to develop components in isolation and produce some documentation website. And then we took this folder and proudly declared it the design system library and shipped it as a semantically versioned NPM package that people could install. We were so lazy that we didn't even bundle our JavaScript or CSS code, and we just shipped it as sources. Instead, we went to town on code quality tooling. Like, we figured that if we're going to start developing these new components, they have to be extra high quality and extra reliable. So we have set up linters for everything, including our markdown for documentations, pretty high unit test coverage threshold, and also had a component generator to take care of our boilerplate so that it is consistent. We packed it all into continuous integration pipeline that essentially did two things. It deployed the documentation website and the new version of NPM package every time we bumped it. That was it. This is how we started our UI library. And there were some pros to this minimal approach. So first of all, before the bulk of the work on design patterns started, we had our tooling kind of ready. We didn't even change it that much over all the years. The fact that we started developing the patterns in isolation generated a byproduct, which is great. It's a usage documentation. And the public documentation website, it is public from day one, kind of became a playground and source of truth for all. So everybody, including designers and product specialists, they just like to went to the site, see what's available, tinker with the things, and so on. And even the fact that we were too lazy to bundle the code played into our hand in the beginning, because we were able to enjoy the hot reload when developing simultaneously on the library and on our pilot product. And of course, the code quality tooling, we were able to write more or less consistent code from day one. Because it was more or less consistent, whenever new maintainers came to the library, they required much less onboarding. And it also helped us scale front-end best practices Bruce has been talking about earlier. Fun fact about that is when we were struggling with adoption of the library a little bit, people who wouldn't use the components would still come to our library to kind of borrow the code for their projects. So we were really happy at that point that at least it looked good from the inside as well. The disadvantages of that, for example, of shipping sources were, of course, the technical difficulties around. We had to work with awkward imports and some dependency resolution problems. And the fact that we put everything in a folder in the same project as the pilot really discouraged other teams from contributing to it. It looked like it was someone else's thing, someone else's code, someone else's project. So we were really struggling with contributions until the moment we literally moved that folder into its own repository. Seems like a really small move, but that was super powerful for adoption. All right, so that was our first release, and after that we started developing patterns. So things that were appearing in our sketch library were the usual design system things, design tokens, icons, layout definitions, and simple components like form inputs or buttons. In the product mocks, however, we had some more complex things, right? Bigger components, some business-specific formatting, display of real estate related information, and so on. So the three biggest questions we kept asking ourselves when developing patterns were this. First of all, what to include in the library? Should it be purely presentational layer, like the UI frameworks do, like the aforementioned Bootstrap and so on? Or is business logic actually a fair game? Second was how to split up patterns into components. And here we were looking for doing it in such a way that we actually have a good developer experience for our own sake and for the sake of our adopters and subscribers. And the third question, the usual quandary of any front-end developer, is how to deal with styles. So let's look at this one by one. What to include in the library? I think this question is the hardest to answer when you're just beginning and you have a blank slate and you do not have any subscribers that are actually telling you what they need. So what we tried is looking for the rule of thumb. The first thing we tried is to really lean into atomic design terms and said that we're going to include only atoms and molecules in our design library. And the second thing was that we attempted was only including pure presentational components, agnostic of any translations, client-side routing, no business logic, nothing like that. That went well. Instead of developing patterns, we mostly were having lengthy discussion about what is a molecule or what is an organism. Like they were really deep and philosophical, but we didn't really move forward. So we weren't able to actually structure our library's content. The few subscribers that we had actually had to start to pass all the text that we needed to accessibility because our library didn't support translations. So the apocalypse became real for some components. Subscribers with client-side routing, they also had to opt out of using some components that were requiring plain links. And the logic got duplicated from project to project to project, slightly different every time. So we gave in. This is the example of the navigation that's going to help to illustrate the point. Our first step at these components, the header, the footer, menu for mobile, was to develop them as purely presentational, right? And then our subscriber project, they had to write quite a bit of code to, first of all, wire these components together, to put them in somewhat responsive layout that turned out to be like having slightly different widths and different viewports from project to project, and also to provide all this galore of labels and links that was actually all the same across all our microservices with just like little variation. So we kind of gave up on being super puristic and included localization support, client-side routing, into our library, and we also started shipping some translations with it, right? We mostly use them for accessibility labels, but in case of this particular pattern, we use it for content. People can still override that if they don't want this, but in case you would like to spin up the page that looks exactly like Homegate, this is all the code that you need to write, and it works straight away. And of course, for those who don't want to use this pattern, but want to use the rest of the library, they can opt out of using the component and its dependencies. So the search for rule of thumb ended up with pretty much nothing. We agreed that we're going to have no rigid rules and going to decide on a per-case basis, and that our only criteria for deciding what is actually a pattern-worthy functionality is whether this thing brings value to our product and organization at this very moment. And we also learned that over time those things change, and that's okay. You have to come at peace with it, refactor, adapt, and evolve your design system. And just to avoid some of the extra work that comes with that, we normally let the pattern emerge first, maybe in one or two different subscriber projects, before we decide that it's fair enough to include it in the library. How do we split up patterns into front-end components? When we're talking about that, what we actually want is the components that provide really good developer experience. And developer experience usually boils down to the problem of designing good public API. And for modern JavaScript framework, all of them, the public APIs that we like what we want from these public APIs to be. They want them to be minimal so that we don't have to write too much code ourselves. We want them to be consistent so that we don't have to go all the time back and forth to documentation to do something with these components. And we want those APIs to be predictable so that we kind of can guess by just looking at what component can, like what kind of properties component provides, we can guess what it's going to do. So again, for modern frameworks, the components public API is pretty much this. It's the props and the types of those props. It's events and the payloads they're carrying. And it's slots and their scope. So I'm using Vue.js terminology here. So for React people, it's props children. For Angular, it's going to be transclusions. And of course, naming conventions for all of this and the components themselves are super, super important. So how do we deal with designing these things? Our current approach is to declare as few props and events as possible. And I'm saying this, but, oops, wrong clicker button. Sorry, guys. Tick, 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 tick. There. So what I was going to do is to actually try my new clicker that I'm still not accustomed to. I'm saying that we declare as few props as possible, but here, this is a real component that has 16 props still shipped from our library, so that is clearly like an API design blunder. And this is a problem because this component has kind of multiple personalities. It does 3 different things depending on different combinations of props that you pass to it. And yeah, it's really difficult to use. We also avoid passing around deep data structures through props and events because those usually have to be learned by your adopters and they are kind of a hassle to validate. Even though we use TypeScript, it's still like we miss things here and there. Another thing that's really good to do is to provide reasonable defaults to all your props and to design those default values in such a way that they cater for the most frequently used use cases so that people who are using your library don't have to write any special props or provide any special values in most cases. That makes for super concise subscriber code. And of course, descriptive and consistent naming, super important. Nothing angers people more than the same thing being named differently from component to component. And the last thing that also is kind of obvious, people keep saying that, but we made mistakes there as well, is to avoid leaking third-party library if you're using any. So that API shouldn't leak into the API of your library, because sooner or later you would love to change that library for something newer, for something better, and if it already is tightly coupled with the bunch of your subscriber projects, that's going to be hard. We have a component like that as well still. So to get all this right, it's usually good to start by imagining the usage of a component. So if we think, for example, about like a menu with sub-menus that pop up, what would you rather use? Would you rather use the component on the left and assemble this entire magic data structure? Or would you use a bunch of components on the right that are nicely playing together? So we're clearly going to use the one on the right. That's why it's on the right. It's a kind of a loaded question here. Exactly, but also I want to say that this is no way a recipe that is going to fit all the companies and all kinds of engineers. This is something we figured out that works much better for us. How to deal with styles? So there are a few ways to pass styles around from file to file, project to project. So there are your usual variables, either CSS or if you're using any preprocessors, could be Sass or less. They're good for simple tokens like storing colors and spacings and so on. And if you need to pass entire rule sets around, you would usually declare either utility classes or styled components. So utility classes, even though they're kind of natural to declare and easy to use, they have a few disadvantages from our standpoint. They are ever present in your production bundle, unless you do some tree-shaking CSS magic, which is kind of special. It doesn't matter if you use them or not. They're going to sit around. If you have enough of utility classes, they are also, they could get widely used and they're going to spread around your projects. And the moment you want to refactor or rename those, that might be a hassle. Using utility classes heavily could also kind of weaken your brand consistency because subscribers are free to combine them in any kind of way. And without a good, tight feedback loop with your UX designers, people can just come up with some illicit combinations that do not follow design principles. And of course, we need to take extra care about naming those classes because the CSS might leak otherwise. With styled components, you have almost none of those disadvantages. And again, modern frameworks like Vue, React, and Angular, they all have ways of auto namespacing within your components, so leaky CSS is not a problem. And another thing that you could use for that, if you're using a preprocessor of some sort, it's mixin. So you could just put your rule set in there and share that from your library. What do? We obviously, again, loaded previous slide, lean heavily into styled components. We use them wherever possible. We do ship some utility classes, but we try to keep it to the minimum. In fact, this is the only utility that we are providing, requested by our engineers, who are big fans of Bootstrap, obviously, and this is just a responsive grid. We export some mixins for rule sets, but yeah, the jury is still out on whether it's convenient to use or not, so I'm not gonna recommend that just yet. And of course, all of this like API guidelines that I was just talking about, we figured it out like on our own, made our own mistakes, right, to figure this out. And this is like, yeah, for your entertainment, another all-time favorite blunder that I did, I think, about like 5 times in my career. And I guess I never learned. And the team was also kind of aware of this, like, disadvantages of this naming convention. And yet we somehow, I don't know what happened, still went for it, knowing and thinking that we would never, ever need a spacing of 12 pixels. So things like this happen. We had to rename, we had to refactor, and this is all right, right? If you're growing the design system together bit by bit. So while our pilot project was still being developed, other product squads already were super eager to start their own things. And we kind of had to face the scaling of the design system before we were ready to scale it. So naturally experienced a few issues there. Thankfully, our UX designers were fully on board for the design system. They were ready to put in extra work, extra effort. Our product specialists, they were kind of undecided. They liked using the existing components if they were already available. But when it came to like giving teams time to contribute and develop more components or improve existing ones, they were kind of reluctant, really cautious about that. And the population that we really needed to sell design system to, funny-wise, was the engineering population. They were not entirely convinced that that's the way to go. So the issues we started seeing is that the components got forked instead of used. They were not really adjusted. The ones that were actually contributed back to our design system sometimes didn't follow the design system principles. Sometimes, as you've seen with the example of the collapsible, our public APIs got bloated because people just kept piling props on and on. Some subscribers prefer to stick with the older versions of the libraries because that thing worked for them and all the new breaking changes were really hard to integrate or migrate to. And we kind of didn't receive much bug reports or feature requests to this thing. It was like floating around in this vacuum of feedback. And naturally, all of that led to some general skepticism. When I summarize it all on the same slide, like it looks pretty grim, like these kind of things were spaced out in time. So it took us a while to actually realize that we have adoption issues. And once we did, we had to do something about it. So what were the main reasons why these adoption issues even happened? So the existing patterns that we had in the library by the time, either there was not enough of them, or they were not covering the necessary use cases. The design principles that some contributors didn't follow kind of existed in the heads of a few people or were documented somewhere that was not accessible to everybody. And sometimes engineers were just simply not sure how to make changes and how to release them because it was something set up by someone and they had to learn how to work with this. And there was no place to report bugs to and no people to talk to about different features requests because the library was kind of a no man's land for a while. We fixed it by actually taking the people who were super excited and really wanted this design system to happen and making a little community out of them. So we had 4 UX designers and 6 engineers from different product squads that really wanted this to happen. I think some design system experts, like when they talk about design system teams, they call it the federated model. You can look that up. And we were super lucky to have subject matter experts in different areas on this committee. Like we had UX researchers, accessibility experts, some people who did design systems before, web performance experts, etc. We started meeting every 2 weeks to discuss different issues and proposals. We were able to take away small assignments, like little bug fixes here and there, nothing big, unfortunately, because our main challenge was actually finding time besides our usual work on the actual products. However, there's been a lot of learning and sharing going on between those people, and we even managed to make the design system approach a little bit more popular with the rest of the company by doing some talks and workshops internally. And then this happened. I think this is kind of a dream of every design system enthusiast or design system salesperson. In January this year, Homegate turned 20, which is a great time to reinvent one's identity, I guess. And we had a rebranding planned. And I have to say that our marketing department was surprised and thrilled that changing the basic color scheme that we have in all the core products required almost no engineering effort. So that was the moment when people who were looking skeptical at all this esoteric work on design systems, they understood what it's for. And our little guild gained recognition for its work. It gained some significant time budget that we could share among our members to actually do improve things. And we got to it. So we were able to develop more patterns, provide better documentations for all the aspects from installation and usage guidelines to design principles, coding, and API guidelines. We established some processes that were also transparent to the rest of the company, how to contribute, how to release, how to deprecate certain things, and of course, how to file bug reports. And finally established communication channels and people who were there in those channels to respond. We even tried the requests for comments for bigger things. So this is pretty much where we're at the moment with our, I'm not sure, baby or adolescent design system. I'm gonna have to take a look into the maturity model. And if I have to make key takeaways of that journey, I would have to say that we need to remember that the more products design system powers, the better it becomes. So we really have to invest in adoption. The grassroots design systems, they start slow, but they can succeed over time with enough enthusiasts. So there is no reason to give up in the middle of the way. Technical decisions have to be thought carefully because they can seriously influence adoption and engagement. And ignoring the people part of the design systems can damage your design system reputation and quality. So we cannot go too long without communication, without fostering collective ownership and these kind of things. So everybody meet Domus. This is how we named our design system. It has to have a name. And in Latin it means home, household, or family. And I guess like any household in real life, it's kind of rough around the edges still. And yeah, if you would like, check out our documentation. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olga. That was a great, great talk. So I have we have a lot of questions. I don't think we can get through all of them. They're all by anonymous, I think. So let's just start with the first one, which is, are you looking at tighter couplings between design tooling and code, e.g. by building plugins for Sketch, Figma, allowing you to export specific things?
Right. I'm going to redirect that question to Zuzha. She's shaking her head. Does it mean we're not looking at... So as far as I know, we're currently looking at which tool do we want to actually use for our design, Sketch or Figma. We have some mocks there and some mocks there. So I guess we'll have to decide on that first before looking at any kind of plugins. At the moment, no.
Great. So also, if you have any questions here in the room, please raise your hand. I will look up occasionally to check. So next question, how did you choose the tool to create / document the style guide?
We tried a thing that was called, I think, Vue Design System, because we thought, okay, we're building a design system, that sounds right, which was based on the Vue Style Guidist, which is a wrapper for React Style Guidist. So we had to like get rid of a few of those layers in the progress, so we stuck with the Vue Style Guidist. It kind of worked for us. It generates Vue documentation for the properties. Still has React under the hood, but it's not weird after 3 years. Yeah.
All right. So the next question comes from Andre, sorry. Do you do any visual regression testing for your components?
So for design system library, we're currently looking at integrating testing library. For now, it's just unit testing. We do a lot of visual testing on the individual projects. So those are tested like from the user perspective. Yeah. But that's something we definitely need because we're accumulating more and more CSS in our library.
Yeah, good question. All right, next question comes from Anonymous again. Is your design system used with other frameworks than Vue too? Did you evaluate using vanilla web components initially?
So we were supposed to help the Vue.js project. That was the first goal. So that's why we have like a bunch of Vue.js components there and CSS, which could be used with anything pretty much. And now I think we're going to spin up a few React projects for various business reasons. So we're thinking of actually providing some components for React. The way to do it, we still have to figure out what works with our engineering capabilities and skills that we have at the company, whether it's going to be web components or something else.
Okay, if you want to help.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think we might have time for 2 more questions. So just checking if anyone wants to ask a question here. Over there. Let me just run over real quick.
I'm scared now.
Can you talk about any metrics or analytics that you're tracking on the design system to measure its success, that kind of thing?
Yes, we did, especially when we were struggling with getting some understanding from people. Why do we need to invest this time? And we really tried to advocate for the time for the guild to work on that. We just so far looked at the number of components that were adopted, the number of projects or percentage, like 100% of Vue.js projects use our design system, which is like, I'm proud to say. Yeah, I guess we would need to do a bit more.
If you want to help.
Yeah, what would you recommend? There's lots. Okay,
lots
we have to talk.
There's a mingling happening later.
Yeah.
All right, final question from Anonymous again. Would you still use Sass when starting from scratch or rather rely on CSS directly?
So that decision also was kind of a matter of taste of our engineers. We started set up the entire library with CSS and some post-CSS plugins initially, but it felt weird for a lot of people who were coming from the backend background to know that their variables can be overridden just like that. So they wanted something that resembles the programming a little bit more. We suggested a preprocessor. We'll see if it's still... So far, it doesn't bring much problems.
It might be replaced with something new in a couple of years anyway.
So we adopted this mindset kind of that nothing is set in stone, and if something better comes along, we'll just change it.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Olga.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk.
Yeah. Thank you all.